Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this program highlighting the work of our library fellows, past and present. My name is Michael Ryan. I am Vice President and Librarian of the New York Historical Society, and it's a pleasure to have you with us on this chilly evening. As I said, our programs highlight the work of fellows, not only current fellows, but fellows who have been here previously. And tonight we are doing the latter, celebrating the publication of his first book, a book that the research for which he did in part in our collections. I want to begin by just a quick anecdote to introduce our guest and our interlocutor this evening. In January of 2014, when I started at the New York Historical Society, I was made aware of the fact that there was coming up for auction a rather important manuscript, which was unsigned, something like a dozen pages, a dozen leaves. And it was a draft of a letter written from the Continental Congress to the people of England on the eve of the Declaration of Independence, giving them one last chance to acknowledge the wrongs that Parliament had done and to join with the colonists in making their case to the British government. Of course, the effort failed, but the author was identified as Robert R. Livingston. It was unsigned, and the New York Times article that ran the piece said that the document had been authenticated by a Yale graduate student. And I thought, what? A Yale graduate student? I mean, couldn't they find, someone distinguished? Among all of the colonial scholars on the East Coast, a Yale graduate student, and it didn't name him. And it was only later that I learned that that manuscript had been authenticated by none other than our guest this evening, Dr. Michael Hattem. Extraordinary accomplishment for somebody still at the graduate level of his career. But that's the remarkable fellow that Dr. Hattem is, a truly accomplished scholar, incredibly bright, penetrating, and incisive. As I said, he's no stranger to our collections. He's used them many times before. He used them when he was at City College, and after City College when he went to Yale to get his PhD. He was a Schwartz Fellow here in 2017 and 18, and now he's back teaching at Yale once again. Dr. Hattem's interest is in historical memory, what it is and how it shapes behavior. Which is the subject of his book, Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution, which seeks to understand how it happened that a people who considered itself British became American. Dr. Hattem will be joined in conversation by Dr. Benjamin Carp, Associate Professor of History at Brooklyn College. Professor Carp is a graduate of Yale, after which he took his PhD at Virginia. He's the author of two important studies of the American Revolution, Defiance of the Patriots, the Boston Tea Party and the Making of America, and Rebels Rising, Cities in the American Revolution. The format this evening will be the same format we adopt in all our programs. We'll have a conversation between Michael and Ben for about 40 minutes, followed by questions submitted by you through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So if you have a question at any time during the course of the conversation, you can type it in and send it, and we'll get to it at the conclusion of the program this evening. Without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Ben, to lead the conversation.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thanks to the New York Historical Society for giving me the opportunity to ask Michael about this really wonderful book. It's, I think, going to sustain a really rich conversation, one that we'll all be disappointed when we get cut off later this evening. So let me start by asking Michael Hattem, I thought the United States was special. Aren't we a forward-looking country that cuts itself off from the past and never looks back? Why should we study the history of, people looking into American history?
Well, that's kind of the myth, right? This idea that Americans have traditionally been sort of more interested in their present and their future than their past. And that sort of myth has its origins really in the late revolutionary period, the early national period. If you think of the sort of very famous quote by Thomas Jefferson about liking the dreams of the future better than the history of the past, or Crevecoeur's famous essay about the new man, the American as the new man, right? So those are the sources of that myth, but the actual reality of it is much more complicated, and that myth, sort of like many myths about early American history, sort of got complicated or twisted during the 19th century. Industrialization had that effect on a number of historical memories of the early American period. But our relationship with the past really is much more complicated and always has been. And even down to the present, you can see that really in the present where, we constantly see, once a year, we get these reports published about Americans' knowledge of history, right? And regularly, these studies say that Americans, a vast majority of Americans think it's really important to study and understand the American past, and yet those same studies then go on to detail how little Americans tend to know about it, right? And I think
we're constantly aspiring towards a better knowledge of our history,
yeah,
never quite making it.
And that's that's a dichotomy that sort of that's been with us really since the beginning. And I mean, as to why it's important, I mean, I think, I try to make the case in the book that it's that how colonists and later Americans in the long revolutionary era, how they understood the past, how they thought about it, and how those understandings changed over time actually played a significant role in how they perceived their present and how they sort of negotiated the revolutionary era. So that's my case for it.
Well, then let me ask you something else, right? I thought, revisionist history was this horrible thing. I mean, I've duct taped my windows against it, and I check the baseboards constantly for any signs of revisionism. In between defending Confederate monuments or criticizing the 1619 project, right? We've all been given this idea that revisionist history is a dirty word. So is the idea of reshaping the past for political purposes something new and threatening, right? Something that's lurking under my bed, or were the nation's founders doing this too?
Yeah. So I mean, I think I hope that the book would make clear that what we now today call historical revisionism, or what some political pundits call historical revisionism, really has its roots in the origins of the Republic itself, and go right back to the Revolution. The quote unquote founders, sort of the big name founders, we're all keenly aware of the importance of crafting historical narratives, especially in the 1780s and 1790s, right, when the results of the American Revolution were still very much up in the air. The idea of historical revisionism actually, I think, comes out of the unusual power of our sort of popular memory of the revolution, right? And part of that we get from popular culture, but another big part of that we get from our sort of, primary education, right? And secondary education. And so what I think, when you hear political pundits calling something historical revisionism, most often that dynamic is some academic historian has written something that challenges, right, a narrative that somebody learned as a child, and really embedded in them, And so when that gets challenged, this has become the standard retort. But I should mention, even in the early national period, somebody like Noah Webster, knew how important it was to teach these patriotism instilling narratives, right, into the nation's school children. So that's why all of his readers, that he is very popular readers for children, included stories from American history, right, starting with Columbus and the story of John Rolfe, and then all the way up to the Revolution. So that aspect of how many Americans get their memory of the American Revolution, that also goes right back to the period.
Yeah, I use this quote all the time, but the late Professor Jan Lewis of Rutgers, New York, used to call this the bedtime story of the American Revolution.
Yeah, sometimes I call it the school book narrative. But yeah, same thing.
Yeah. Well, then, speaking of Noah Webster, right? So was Americans' reverence for the past something that we'd call conservative? Because, right, I thought the revolution was supposed to be a radical break, right? Something disruptive and violent, a new world order, right? Resulting in more power to the people, man, and and all that stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you resolve that problem in the book?
Yeah, so there's two parts to that. The authority of the past is an idea that a phrase that I used to describe a part of colonial culture prior to the revolution, where colonists had inherited, or their ancestors had brought over from 17th century England, a real reverence for the authority of the past, and that's rooted in the common law tradition, really, right, which gives great weight to things like custom and precedent and tradition. And that, that went beyond the law. That was also a part of colonial culture. So that meant that, whether it was a law or a cultural practice, basically meant that the longer that something like that stood, the more authority that was invested in it, right? And so that this is a really important part of what was so intractable about the imperial crisis and this unprecedented legislation that Parliament was passing in the 1760s. But this idea of the authority of the past, I think, is a really important part of colonial history culture that one really needs to understand to be able to understand why colonists were so upset and so distraught in the 1760s.
But then don't their arguments all become about natural rights and constitutional arguments and things like that, right? So how do they go from this kind of reverence of the authority of the past to thinking about this in other terms?
Yeah, so one of the things I was struck when I was doing the research for the book, and because I was doing really systematic readings of the resistance literature from the 1760s and 1770s, was just how late in the game, really, that natural rights and natural law becomes the rhetoric of the colonists, right? It's really not until after 1772, 73 that becomes the dominant rhetorical form of resistance. Before that, what you find in a lot of the pamphlets and newspaper essays, and then trickle down into the sort of local town and county resolves, is that almost all of colonists' arguments, their core arguments against the imperial reforms that Parliament was trying to institute, were rooted in historical arguments, right, and rooted in memories that they had of their colonial past. And the thing that's important about that is that before 1760, there's no such thing as American history, right? That is a later creation. Scholars for a long time have sort of seen it as something that was created later in the early national period. But the first part of my book is really about saying, no, look, that's starting much earlier. That's starting in the 1760s and 1770s, because this is part of their resistance efforts to create a coherent resistance, among 13 sort of disparate and different colonies. And so this sort of shared historical grammar that emerges out of those pamphlets and other sort of resistance writings was really striking to me, I have to say. So I think that we can see them making really historical arguments from everything against the Stamp Act to then in the late 1760s and early 1770s against the parliamentary supremacy, which was the legacy of the Glorious Revolution, right? This is one of the most striking things, I think, or I should say also one of the things that really I've been thinking a lot about parallels to today. If you think about this idea of the authority of the past, right? The colonists had their relationship with Britain, had a customary relationship with Britain over the first half of the 18th century. And, in their mind, that was established, right? That had effectively had the power of law in this common law framework. But the thing is that while colonists retain that sort of 17th century sense of the authority of the past, in Britain, it sort of dissipated over the course of the 18th century. And so this created a real significant, I think, cultural difference between colonists and Britons. But so when Britons get to the 1760s and they've won the 7 Years' War and they have this new unprecedentedly large empire to manage, in their minds, if Parliament needs to pass unprecedented legislation to do that, well, then that would make sense, right?
Yeah, the British are all ready to reform. They're like, come on, guys, catch up. Centralization, it's the wave of the future.
Yeah, that's really the order of business, right, in the 1760s for Parliament and the new sort of ministry, which was to centralize authority within the empire and sort of follow that Spanish model. And for colonists, that did not jive. They couldn't really make sense of that. And one of the things, goes to the sort of contemporary resonance, is, their faith in the authority of the past meant that they were able to develop expectations, right, about the present and the near future, that things aren't going to radically change. Our relationship with Britain is set, and that can't radically change. And so they can develop a sense of stability and of expectations. But once Parliament starts doing all kinds of unprecedented things, right, then all of a sudden all bets are off, right? And it becomes very hard for them how do you plan for the future when you have no idea when anything effectively could possibly happen? And I think, there's been a lot of Americans over the last 4 years who have sort of had a similar psychological experience, right? In colonists, it caused a great sense of anxiety. And I think that's been a similar dynamic in the last 4 years, where you have an administration that has done, a number of unprecedented things and broken some longstanding traditions and customs. And that, if you think about the anxiety that's caused a lot of people in the present, then you can begin to have a sense of the anxiety that would have caused colonists in the 1760s.
All right, but in the end, right, it's the Americans who pull the trigger on, violent action in 1775 and then declaring independence in 1776. After the revolution, did the founding historians, I guess, play up the story of how independence had come about? Or do they try and tamp that down? Did the story of the American Revolution that was told by early American historians, did that look more radical or more conservative to them?
Yeah, so in some sense, the story as it was rather radical, right? I think just as popularly perceived, right? This revolution against the world's largest, this successful revolution against the world's largest empire. And in the 1780s, you start to, you see popular movements continuing, like Shays' Rebellion and these other sort of popular uprisings, drawing on the rhetoric of the revolution and of independence, right? Before that, in the very earliest histories, in the early 1780s, and just in discussions between people who wrote histories and historical related essays and things like that, you see that they're very concerned with making clear that Americans did not aim for independence, that they were sort of pushed into it right? Reluctantly, the British pushed them into independence. But by the 1780s, by the late 1780s, that narrative really starts to sort of shift, and a big reason for that is because of the events of the 1780s, right? All of the popular uprisings, all the problems of the Articles of Confederation, created a situation where the histories that were created in the late 1780s and early 1790s really, in some sense, sought to de-radicalize the revolution, right? And one of the ways that they did that is through a narrative that they created, not about independence, but about the colonial past, right? And there's a famous historical chart that I think we have the graphic of, that sort of graphically represents this narrative that they created. If we can show this historical chart, and what you'll see if we can get the chart up is that it's basically a visual representation of the narrative that you see in lots of the histories of the 1780s, 1790s, and beyond. The chart is from 1810, and it's actually created by one of the most popular historians of the period, David Ramsay. And so what you can see here is a historical timeline, and the green represents free government. This is what the key says, right? And so what you see in this narrative here is that free government exists in the colonies during the reign of Charles the First, all the way up to the Glorious Revolution, right? And then it disappears. And this goes back to another important change in colonist historical understandings during the 1760s and 1770s, which had to do with the Glorious Revolution, whereas that had been the sort of keystone of British civic identity, even for British colonists. It had gotten rid of the tyrannical Catholic king, right? It had created the circumstances that would allow for the British Empire to grow and for its colonies to become successful. But by the 1760s, what colonists thought about the Glorious Revolution really started to change. And rather than seeing it as this great event that had created a situation that had, gotten rid of the tyranny of the king and raised the prerogative of Parliament, instead they came to see it as having created a situation where Parliament basically could act tyrannical with no redress. Right, and so that's why the narrative here changes after the Glorious Revolution, because there is a sense of independence that is lost after the Glorious Revolution and the rise of Parliament. Right, but what you see on the chart is that when independence happens, more towards the right side of the chart, independence is regained. Right, so this is the narrative that they're telling themselves in the early national period, is that we used to be independent and then it was taken away and then we regained our independence, right? Now that's a much more conservative narrative, right? Than to say, things were just going along and then we decided we want to be independent, right? And so this is one part of how the historical writers in the 1780s and 1790s, and I use that term broadly to mean not just people who are writing, historical texts, but, how they were crafting narratives of the long national past that would effectively de-radicalize the revolution, render the revolution as much more conservative than as a sort of spontaneous, popular uprising.
Well, let me ask you about this long narrative past. I mean, the United States is this, from the very beginning, was this kind of diverse, pluralistic country. And as a nation, it wasn't very old. How can it claim to have this deep past by going into the colonial period? Whereas we can see from this chart, there's all this diversity of different kinds of government. There's northern colonies, there's southern colonies, which means that some of these places are going to have to deal with their malign history of being involved with slavery. They all have to deal with their malign history of dispossessing Native Americans, who of course don't show up on this chart at all. Yep. How do they manage all that?
Yeah.
Right? The history that they tell the children.
Yeah. So basically, at least for the purposes of the diversity of colonies, right? This starts during the imperial crisis, but it continues even after. Basically, what they're able to do is, and we sort of take this for granted that like it was a fait accompli that the national history would include the colonial histories of the 13 colonies, the 13 original states going back to their settlement. But I want to stress that that was not a foregone conclusion, right? That had to be constructed, that kind of narrative. And that's what they did in this period. They constructed that narrative. But one of the ways that they sort of got around the diversity of their pasts were basically to apply a sort of flattening out process, right, to the colonial past. You don't really you don't need to get a lot of specifics. A lot of how they did that had to do with as historians' work today does, the process of selection, right? So they would choose events and things to highlight from the past that stressed two really key themes, I think, that are especially important for the political situation of the 1780s and 1790s, and that is independence and unity, right? So the idea is colonies, had always basically been effectively independent from Britain, at least until the Glorious Revolution, and the colonies had always effectively been united, and so they would, play up sort of instances or events from the colonial past that are quite obscure now, but were very prominent in those first histories, like the Siege of Louisbourg, right, in the 1740s, or the New England Confederation of the 1640s. And so through a process of selection, they sort of flattened out the colonial histories, just like they sort of did in the 1760s. You don't see, there are two things that you don't see much of at all in these earliest national histories. One of those things is religion, and the other is slavery, right? And those are two of the key defining, two of the key features that would, two of the key features of the colonial past that were significantly different between regions, right? Those are real sticking points of conflict between those colonies and those states and their histories. So they just get left out. So for example, in 1804, John Daly Burke, who was an Irish immigrant, he writes and publishes the first state history of Virginia after the Revolution, and 3 volumes of the colonial history of Virginia, and barely any mention of slavery in the entirety of the 3 volumes. Really, and I mean, he talks lots about the rise of the tobacco crop and all of that, and just
magically fall from the plants.
Yeah, just really disappear. And that's a conscious decision. I think one of the reasons for that is partly has to do with the fact that because the majority of the nation's first historians were from New England, that the narrative of New England and the narrative of the New England past sets the sort of foundation for the national narrative, right? So when John Daly Burke goes to write a history of Virginia in 1804, there's already been this narrative that you see in the chart, that's already been established for a decade or more, and he has to fit Virginia's history into these themes that are much more applicable, right, to New England history, right? And so that's one of the reasons. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why slavery can be left out of a 3-volume history of colonial Virginia.
Well, how did our hosts at the New York Historical Society deal with this, right? They have to deal with a Dutch past and a couple of slave uprisings, and the fact that the British Army had occupied most of downstate New York for most of the Revolutionary War.
So in the book, in chapter 4, I talk about the rise of the nation's first historical societies, and the sort of network of historians and antiquarians and other politicians and artists and writers who all corresponded with one another about various aspects of writing or doing history. And these were the people who went on to found these first historical societies. There's first the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1792, and then in the first decade of the 19th century, John Bintard and the New York Historical. And I have to say, I focus much more on the Mass Historical and the American Antiquarian Society, But one of the things that really struck me about the origins of the New York Historical Society is that, when John Pintard is doing the sort of legwork to get the New York Historical Society established, one of the things that he did was to put an ad out effectively an ad in the newspaper that basically said, if you know anything about New York's Dutch history, let us know, right? Like they knew, they didn't know much. I mean, if we think about what's written about New York history before 1800, it's really William Smith's history, right, from the 1750s, or I'm sorry, from later, from 1780s, I guess. But William Smith, those histories are they're not, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not complete, and they're quite partisan in their purposes. But so not much was really known, and I think that's an interesting thing to remember, I think, about history in this period. But it doesn't rely. But the propagation of historical memories don't rely on people having a lot of background, right, or on people having a lot of knowledge. People nowadays, for example, there's lots of people, Americans out there who have very strong emotional reactions to thinking about the American Revolution or even the Civil War, and yet they may not know many basic facts about it, right? So it's not really a requirement, but it is interesting that even among the people who were interested in the state's history, right, and the city's history, that even they really didn't know that much. But I should say that one of the other things that's important about those historical societies, all three of them, is that they were all formed to be quote unquote national societies, right? They were all formed, yes, to collect the history of New York City and Massachusetts, but specifically in their charters, right? They say, and all of American history, and all of America, including natural history, right? Mm-hmm. So those institutions played, I think, a really significant role, because before that, if you want to do history in the early republic, you want to be a historian in the early republic, it's not a very pleasant job, right? So you have to find sources, because there are no repositories, there are no archives. Often that meant, hunting down family members of historical figures and hoping to find something. And if you're lucky enough to find sources, you have to transcribe them, right, for yourself. You can't photocopy them, you can't take them with you. So it takes a lot of work, to be a historian in the early national period. And part of that network that I mentioned, part of what they did was to share information about sources, so they weren't replicating, one another's work, unnecessarily. And their experiences in the 1780s of the support that they gave each other really shaped these early societies and what they did and what they continue to do, right? They provide a repository for archives, for historical sources, to preserve them. They make them accessible to historians who want to research them. They provide a forum for historians to interact with one another and get feedback. And we early American historians still use those all three of those places, very heavily. So.
Well, I have a couple more questions that I'm dying to ask, but I also want to provide the opportunity for some of these great questions that are piling up to also get asked. So I don't know whether to leave that up to our hosts, or I don't know, I'll try and slip in one more. Well, so is popular, and for that matter, academic history, always untrustworthy because it's always trying to, as you say on page 185 of the book, make the past look more like the present? This is a deep one.
Depends. It depends on it depends on the purpose that you need to trust it for, mm-hmm. Right? It's important to remember that the idea that we have of academic history, right, as a sort of semi-objective, semi-scientific approach to the past, that's a very late 19th century invention, right? That really developed over the course of the 20th century. It absolutely doesn't, that, not just the profession, but that perspective doesn't apply before that, right? So, you know, historical memories don't rely on on a certain level of truthiness to be persuasive, right? And that's really the thing that matters about a historical memory, is how persuasive it is, right? So I taught a course at the New School in New York City and at Knox that was about the memory of the American Revolution, you know, and my goal for the students in that class was to get them, you know, to be aware when someone is trying to use a historical memory to persuade them of something, right? And especially when they're doing it in a way that's trying to play on some emotional level, right, which is very common. You know, I don't know, like, that trustworthy is really the lens to think about historical memories through, but certainly, you know, the purpose of historical memories and why, what are you trying to be persuaded of by these people who are employing the historical past? You know, when a politician or someone like that uses the historical past, right, to try to persuade you, then you know, that should raise some kind of critical flag in you as a sort of you know, consumer of historical memory. Yeah.
All right, one last question for me then. You're very polite in the book, saying that your book enriches previous work on the American Revolution. But what have historians missed, right? Where would you like our understanding of the revolutionary period to go, either in places like New York Historical Society or in the classroom, right? How can we improve our telling of this story, besides by all making sure we buy this?
Yeah.
Thoroughly.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, the revolution is, and this is one of the other analogous points to the 1760s. Just like colonists were rethinking the Glorious Revolution, we're very much in a moment of rethinking the American Revolution right now in this country. A good portion of this country is, you know, very much reconsidering the legacy of the American Revolution, and we see that in the 1619 Project and the debates surrounding that. So in that sense, we're also experiencing something similar to the 1760s. I think, you know, what my book tries to do is not to disprove anything or everything that came before, but to add a cultural dimension, right, to how we understand the origins and causes of the revolution. We have a pretty good understanding of the cultural consequences of the revolution, I think. But, you know, for the last 50, 60 years, you know, we've had constitutional interpretations, economic interpretations of the coming of the revolution. And I think that there's still more there. I think that what I do in this book with history culture is one aspect, I think, of trying to understand the cultural origins and causes of the revolution. And I think that there's a lot more to be done there. Historians have been, you know, we've sort of been working within a paradigm established, you know, half a century ago by John Murren of Anglicization, the idea that colonists were becoming more British over the course of the 18th century, right? But so then how do you explain the political break, right? And my book argues that at least this history culture is one aspect of one example of a cultural break that had to happen to make the political break possible. So I'd like to see more of that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you both. It's been a marvelous conversation, very rich, very probing, raised a lot of issues, and we have a lot of questions, actually. So hang on, and we will try to get through most of them. First question, I am interested in Dr. Hattem exploring the role sectionalism played in creating and reshaping these narratives. How different were the history cultures produced by Northern authors versus Southern?
Yeah, so this is something I touched on a little bit before, but I mean, I will say that, you know, because these historians and other producers of historical cultural works in the early Republic, because their express goal, they're what we might call cultural nationalists, right? Their express goal is to create a shared identity for the new nation, right? That would help bind together the states and turn the United States from a plural noun into a singular noun, right? So their focus is in a very broad sense comes from a national perspective, right? So they're really trying to play down regional differences. That's one of the reasons why, you know, John Daly Burke's History of Virginia is so strange to read, because it has to make such ridiculous leaps in the interpretations, right? Really, to make Virginia seem like New England, right? So they very much tried to play down and sort of flatten sectional differences. Now, I'm speaking specifically of the 1780s, 1790s, and maybe early 1800s, right? It's the case that as you move further into the antebellum period, sectionalism becomes much more visible in the histories that are being produced, right? Than in this period, and the same goes to Roy's question about religion, right? There's very much a flattening or even just ignoring of those aspects of the past that might stoke any sense of division, and so they just try to ignore it. And you know, that's not very, I mean, you know, we've done that even in, you know, throughout much of the 20th century, and for some ways even into the 21st century. The way that early national historians left slavery out of the narrative of early American history, you know, continued basically until the 1960s, 1970s, right? So we're still living with the legacy that of the choices made by many of these early national historians.
Another question, maybe you've already addressed this, Michael, touches on religion. What is the role of religion, particularly Christianity, in these history cultures? How did the need of competing Christian denominations in creating and demarcating their own specific denominational histories relate to the historical arguments, narratives deployed in straightforward political contexts?
So again, in the national histories, religion is not is really downplayed, especially denominational differences, right? But that's not. But at the same time, you know, it's important, and I talk about this in the first chapter of the book, which is that historical understandings that colonists had were critical to their religious identities, especially in the colonial period, but even after, right? If what it means to be, you know, a Congregationalist in New England in the 1740s is, you know, directly informed by people's understanding of the historical treatment, right, of Puritans and the Anglican Church, right? Same thing, you know, what it means to be an Anglican in the colonies in that time is distinctly influenced by the history of Puritanism, the history of the Civil Wars, right? And the same thing goes if you think about in Virginia and Maryland, you know, Anglicanism, the history of Anglicanism there. So within regional history cultures, and this is a place where there's still a lot more to be done, because I focused so heavily on, you know, the national history culture and the development of a national history culture. There's still a ton of work, I think, to be done on these regional history cultures and how they developed and how they changed over time, right? Because they get flattened in the national narratives. But, you know, Pennsylvania has its own history culture where, you know, William Penn is this huge celebrated figure, a really meaningful figure, right? New England has its own history culture. In the South, they were less developed, and the same goes for some of the middle colonies like New York, you know. But I'd love to see you know, historians look more into the regional history cultures.
If I could intervene too, everyone should go to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and they have that great painting of William Penn, right? And their creators know how to interpret that so well. But Roy's question makes me think that denominational history cultures would also be an interesting subject.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another question, Dr. Hattem, what key events, moments do you highlight in your book to show the progressive way in which the British Empire breaks down in the colonies? Dr. Carp does this in defiance of the Patriots with the Boston Tea Party, and I'm wondering if you point to a key moment like that as well.
Yeah, I don't think that there's, you know, a single key moment. I mean, you know, each piece of legislation, I think, you know, is sort of succession of key moments, I think, right? Because they're convincing the colonists that there is a systematic, coordinated plan, which there was for centralizing authority. But I think, if there's maybe, one of the key turning points in the first half of the book is this turn towards natural rights language, right? Which basically lets them keep arguing from the same principles that they've been arguing based on the British Constitution, but instead now they sort of universalize them by calling them natural rights, right? So they're able to push the British past out of the equation, right? There you go, in my interlude. And the thing that's interesting about that, and somewhat ironic about that, is that it's really their commitment to the authority of the past that drives them ultimately to this innovation of all innovations, being declaring independence, right? And if there's a second turning point, it's probably the one thing that I don't really talk much about in the book, and that's the war, right? Without the war, you don't have the early national period, right? And so because my book is largely focused on print, and print production drops drastically during the war, and cultural production. So I really didn't address much in the wartime period, but so much of what happened during the war, sort of sets the stage for how people are going to think about the past, in the decades afterwards.
I have a couple of questions actually about sources of historical memory, Michael. What sources did you use? What are the tributaries feeding historical memory?
Yeah.
And to what extent, say, do oral traditions play a large role in that?
Yeah. So this is sort of part of this idea of history culture. One of the benefits of it was that, a lot of the work that had been done on this topic in early America, at least, was around the bicentennial, and really focused on a few of the sort of most famous historical works of the period, the most famous histories of the Revolution by David Ramsay and Mercy Otis Warren. But so I used this idea of history culture to sort of broaden that out and to think more broadly. And so I looked at things like poetry, the emergence of American fiction, the emergence of American painting and art. I looked at things like children's readers and textbooks and things like that. Essays about education. I looked in for much of the first half of the book, I'm looking at political writings. What were the history and political writings? So I tried to get beyond just historical works, and I tried to show how interpretations that might appear in a historical work end up spreading, and end up being replicated in various other cultural forms. And when that happens, that's when you can start thinking about a historical memory, right? Like, one historian publishes a book, that's not creating a historical memory, right? But when you see the narrative that they are perpetuating or creating, when you see that narrative being adopted and used in various other forms and in other places, then you can start thinking about historical memory. So I do not do much with oral culture, actually, and I think that's another spot for really fruitful future work.
So one final question for both of you, actually, and I'm going to reframe it here. This comes from somebody who must be teaching at either high school or college level, who asks, what can historians and teachers, how can they grapple with received authority about the past when trying to talk about new developments in the field? In other words, what do you do with the received standard accounts, the unrevised standard version, if your job is in fact to teach history?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great challenge. I think, teaching the American Revolution at the college level, it's easy to feel like half of that job is blowing up some previous narrative that students learned, right? So, I mean, you have to, and, I'm not currently teaching at the moment, so maybe Ben is better to ask this question. But, I think for me, the thing is that students at almost every level, but certainly from junior high or high school on, need to understand the nature of the practice of history, right? That history is not an objective account of an unquestioning objective account of what definitely happened, right? But all of us, even historians, are reconstructing the past and reconstructing narratives out of the sources that we have and the sources that we choose to use. And I think, it's been my experience in the classroom that, at least at the college level, that when students really take that to heart, that it kind of frees them up in a way, right? Because now it becomes less about am I right or am I wrong than about, what do I think and what can I support in terms of an argument. So I think, just getting students to understand the practice of history and the nature, the subjective nature of history, I think is important to that. Ben.
And the only thing I'd add for K to 12 history, right, in my perspective, is just having a mother who is a speech pathologist in elementary schools and a father who is a high school social studies teacher, right? Obviously, there's stuff that the state requires everybody to know and pass. For us New Yorkers, it's the Regents exam, right, and things like that. But when teachers are given the time and freedom to be creative, to introduce narratives that they think will speak to their students, then they can have that dialogue between the kind of standard account and, empowering students to kind of think about history in their own way. In systems where it gets a lot more rigid, that can be more difficult.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for really quite a memorable, as it were, evening. I know I've learned a lot, and I hope our audience has too. And it's been great having you with us. And Michael, again, congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Michael.
Everyone go out and buy it and read it. It's a fantastic book. It's on a great topic, and we will all profit from it. I want to remind our audience that we will be back on Friday, same time, same station, looking at images of slaves after emancipation, sort of a tour of the iconographic representation of slaves after emancipation. Should be an interesting evening. Thank you again. Thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to say good night to you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.